Welcome to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry. In every episode, we explore how people from educators and artists to executives and entrepreneurs lead with authenticity, rise through adversity, and share the wisdom they've gained along the way. Today's guest is Chad Patterson, a serial entrepreneur and technologist who has spent more than 15 years building at the intersection of finance, growth, and systems design across Fortune 100 companies and early stage ventures. But what truly defines Chad's leadership is his commitment to people, especially those whose talent and potential are often overlooked because of circumstance rather than capability. Welcome to Expressions of Leadership, Chad. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. My pleasure. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, Chad, you've said that you were raised humble. What did leadership look like in your household growing up?
I think that's a good question, Michelle. I think leadership was really modeled, and it was demonstrated. I think a lot of folks oftentimes have a big boisterous voice, but it doesn't really align with their actions. I think for me, growing up in a single parent home, that leadership was really demonstrated day in and day out. I think also that demonstration was done through discipline. So, we would wake up on Saturdays every morning and clean faithfully, like the whole house, right? We had to make our beds, so like those things instilled like repetition and the importance of being disciplined. But I think also, what was demonstrated, you know, more significantly than others was just like being selfless and really being concerned with the greater good of like the group of everyone versus like an individual desire. And I think the other part is like respect. Like respect has always been paramount and centralized, like for my moral compass. I think giving people respect, typically you get that in return. So I think, that was also a big staple in my household and being demonstrated where, my mom would say, "Hey, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this new environment or this experience?" Which even at a younger age, it, offered some autonomy, right? And buy-in versus her telling us like we're going to do something or just dictating to us. So I think that level of respect was really demonstrated in a multitude of different ways throughout my formidable years.
And your mother went back to school at age 40 while raising three kids and dedicating her life as a pastor to helping people with disadvantaged lives. What leadership values did you absorb simply by watching how she lived?
Yeah, I think that leadership was really demonstrated through like constant growth, right? Like leadership is not about having the answers always or, being in these comfortable moments and environments. I think for anyone, going back to school at the age of 40 plus and being back in a, structured curriculum and things of that sort, having to listen to other people when you have three kids of your own, I think that could be really challenging and uncomfortable. But I think, leaning into that uncomfortability is something that I think has been a competitive advantage of mine throughout my life. And it's because I saw that, being demonstrated through my mom's ability to say, "Hey, look, I want more." And, I always say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. I think she demonstrated she wanted more by putting herself in an uncomfortable environment to go and actually achieve what she felt was in her grasp. So I think for me, you know, in order to use your gift in the best way, I think it's about uplifting others and, not taking advantage of others. I think, that's something that my mom has demonstrated for me is, her gift of being able to galvanize people and give people hope and when they feel like they're hopeless is just a prime example of her being a leader and saying, "Look, I want to, bring you to the next level. And I think you have the ability to achieve, that next level greatness." And I think that is a great demonstration of being selfless and again something that was modeled throughout my vulnerable years and it continues to be modeled.
And speaking of that, when did you realize that leadership for you was about creating access and dignity, not just personal success.
Yeah, so that's when I started my first company. I was 24 years old, and I saw like a market opportunity where the athleisure space was not even like developed. I always felt like wearing hoodies or sweatshirts and stuff that kind of could look slouchy. And I wanted to create something where people felt comfortable in what they were wearing. Also, but then being able to be in transferable environments, right? Like I wear black. I really like black. I think that's a transferable color. Um, but I wanted people to feel a little bit more um, relaxed in like their attire. And then in building that, Michelle, a lot of things that was very new to me. And I was working in corporate America at the time for the Hershey Company. So I was simultaneously building my first company. And, I think the part of having to hire a team, and having to manage complex like logistic initiatives and like establish a brand and a voice and like what that looks like, I think for me, it was a, a moment to really think about like, I have a vision, I have to build something that other people are going to appreciate and have an affinity for. And I can't do that alone. I have to do that with other folks who have a skill set and have value to provide that is diverse from what I bring to the table. And I think that was a big moment for me to realize. And I was in a sales role when I was with the Hershey Company. So that was just, hey, here's your numbers, here's your target, like go and execute. It wasn't a very collaborative type of space. I think having to build something that it was more of a ecosystem and a group type of concept and environment. I think that was when I really had to understand, all right, leadership is about creating more opportunity for others and doing so in a manner where it's not about your success, it's about the greater good of like the common goal of what you're trying to achieve as a group.
And when you're working with groups, trust becomes really important, but it isn't freely given. It has to be earned. How did those experiences shape the way that you think about trust as a form of leadership currency?
Yeah, I think that's a great way and to look at it. For me, trust is acquired over time, right? Like trust is developed through consistency, not unpredictability. And I think trust is really earned through the most intimate moments. I remember a scenario one time in high school, and one of my coaches, um, he was meeting with a person, and this kid just wasn't like really doing his best job. And the coach was talking to him and really was just starting to ask about just like off the field type of questions about like what's going on at his home. And he realized like there was just some friction and his parents was going through a divorce and he was, maybe having to switch schools and it was a lot of noise. And I remember the coach saying like, all right, like I understand what you're going through. And hey, I had to go through that when I was growing up around your age. And this is what I did. And this is how I approached it. And I think he became more of a silent, mentor almost to that teammate of mine. And I think throughout those moments, he was also able to build trust simultaneously with that actual player. And when there was times to coach that player really hard, like he was able to really optimize that guy's skill set because he already established trust. Like, hey, I'm here for you. I'm going to be, in your best interest. I'm going to be in your corner. So I can say things to you that you may not like because intrinsically I want the best for you, right? And I'm not saying something to, harm your feelings or marginalize you. I'm saying something to you to really get you to achieve your greatness, right? And I think that is like a moment of those intimate settings where you build trust with people. And I think that allows you to be a value add to their life and to their, existing responsibilities. So I think that's how trust is really developed over time.
Mhm. And now you work with people who often have immense value, but aren't really recognized, maybe because of their status. How does your lived experience help you see the leadership potential where others might overlook it?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of small, medium-sized businesses, and they may have not gotten the IPO, right, of a Fortune 500 or 100 company. But I think for me, I've always indexed people based on their behavior, not their status. I've come across a lot of financially wealthy people, and I realized that you could be rich financially, but also have a poor character. You know, so I think really understanding people's behaviors and how they treat folks who can do things for them versus folks who can't do things for them. And I've always realized you should treat the janitor the same way you treat the CEO, right? And it's a level of respect that you should establish with everyone that you come across. And I think the other part is just learning people's story and understanding their why. I feel like we all have a story as a human, and we're kind of driven it for different ways in different kind of angles. And I think, what really helps me understanding like individuals and their experience and how they perhaps are even overlooked at times is just really understanding their behaviors and understanding their general philosophy on life. That typically, gives me a really deep understanding of their lens of how they view things, how they view themselves, how they view other people viewing them. And I think, that is something that as a leader gives me a better understanding of how I can support them and be a cheerleader for their goals and what they're looking to achieve.
And I think that trust that you talked about earlier is also really key to them wanting to share their story with you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you have to, everything is a relationship driven environment, right? Like people may not agree to that always, but like people like doing business with people they like. People like hang out with people they like. People hire people that they like who may not be the best, talent or, by merit shouldn't deserve that role, but they may have established a good relationship or they may be a good cultural fit, So, I think really understanding relationships and how they could be extremely valuable and immensely commoditized. I think that is all driven from trust. When you look at investors, a lot of times early on, investors will invest in the founder because they have established some sort of trust with that founder or they see themselves, in that founder. And a lot of times it's not about like the economics, right? Sometimes it's just simply, hey, I believe in this person or I like their story and I think they have the ability. So, I think trust and relationships go hand in hand, right? You typically don't establish relationships with someone until you have like an intrinsic trust kind of formality established. So yeah, I would agree with you. The trust element is extremely important throughout any relationship that's being cultivated.
And speaking of investors and relationships, you've also had to prove yourself across very different environments, corporate spaces, entrepreneurial spaces, and community centered work. How did those moments shape your sense of self belief and clarity as a leader?
Yeah, so Michelle, I think anyone that knows me, they will say unilaterally that I do not have any lack of confidence, right? So I think I've always just had belief in myself. I think growing up, my mom would always say those type of things, right? Like you could do whatever you want. Like I believe in you and whatever, you feel you need to achieve, like you can achieve those things. So I think belief is something that I intrinsically just have fortunately, right? I know a lot of folks who have great talent, but they just don't have the confidence. I think for me, more so to your question, Michelle, like I've curated myself into a leader that I always wanted to have, right? And, who I believe the world needs. There's a variety of different forms of leadership. I think for me, what has led me to cultivate my leadership kind of personality is exactly that, right? Is like understanding the type of leaders I had that I did like, or the type of leaders that I was exposed to that I didn't like, and like what I would want out of a leader really gives me kind of like a compass. And I think, that type of kind of philosophy, intrinsically injected like belief because I always have a true understanding of like my approach and I lead with intentionality. I lead with like strategic thinking and like non-emotional decisions. So it gives me like some stability to really lean into. I would say, my belief was really authentic into like what I'm building and who I am as a leader, and then also provided like the clarity, as I alluded to, that gave me the vision on how to be the best leader, and it's all driven through purpose. So, I think for me, it's a lot of times, people are always going to be in spaces. My uncle says this, and I think this is a very smart way of thinking. Like you're either overpaid or underpaid, right? Like there's really no middle area. And I think, you're always having to prove yourself, and some are great at doing it better than others. Some are great at showing it better than others. I think I'm always been a great, I can show you better than I can like tell you. I distribute my value through execution and showing you versus, a lot of talking. A lot of people do a lot of talking about what they can do and they sell a great story. And then when it's time to show up and execute, they go missing. I think for me, having my North Star of what I want to embody as a leader continues to shape my decision making, continues to shape my emotional intelligence, and it continues to shape how I want to be perceived, currently or in the future, what folks that I do come across from a leadership perspective.
Well, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll talk about navigating crossroads, choosing entrepreneurship, and what it takes to build something meaningful when the stakes are personal. Stay with us. True transformation starts from within. The Forward Project partners with organizations to create meaningful culture shifts and develop leaders who inspire real change. If your team is ready to move forward with purpose, visit www.theforwardproject.co. You're listening to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, and today I'm joined by serial entrepreneur and technologist Chad Patterson. Now, Chad, your dad and your uncle were both entrepreneurs, so you got to see the highs and the lows early on. What did watching their journeys teach you about risk and resilience?
Yeah, I think that probably those experiences probably more valuable than actually working in corporate America and having some experience that way. One thing I definitely learned, Michele, is like it takes money to make money, right? Like so that is something that's like really true. So I learned that early on, but also learned that a lot of times you have to risk everything just to achieve one thing. But that one thing is so profound, it could be life changing. I think, and that's the difference between people who give up at the goal line and people who continue to like push through is the resiliency to say, I'm willing to risk it all, put it on the line because I believe in that one thing. And I believe that one thing is so unique and special that not only will it be life changing for me, it'll be life changing for other people. So I think, my dad is from Alabama. My uncle's also from Alabama. They have a very Southern perspective on just, never quitting, when things get grave or, things look pretty meek. I think oftentimes understanding that right before the success comes a storm, and you have to navigate through those storms and throughout, business and being a leader there's always going to be a variety of storms and volatility. And I think having the resiliency to say, look, this is just a moment, I'll get through this moment and I'll figure things out. And this is an area where I'm going to, learn from it. So it becomes a valuable experience for me. I think those are the modeled behavioral approaches that I was able to learn from, my dad who's an entrepreneur and my uncles who had an oil company. On Saturdays, all my cousins, we would go and work at the oil company. I think we were underpaid. too, just to give you some context there. But we worked all day and we were around our family, and we did real blue collar work, but we were helping folks in the community who may not have the funds to afford oil, and we live in Boston, so it gets pretty cold here. And it was always great sometimes seeing moments, Michelle, where a customer may have not had the money, but my uncles would still put oil in their home because they knew, well, I have kids and I have a family, and how would I feel not giving oil to a family when I know they have kids and it's cold out. And those are the moments that, like, that shape, you never forget those type of things. And I think as a leader, sometimes doing the things that may not make sense financially, but does make sense from a culture standpoint and from a morale standpoint. I think those are the moments when you have to step up as a leader and say, you know what, like, this may not help our bottom line, but at the end of the day, morally, I'm going to help someone who is a human and who needs it, and in return, I'll get blessed at a later time. So those type of things, again, you never forget, and when that is demonstrated, you take those type of learnings and implement that into your approach as a leader. At least I did.
And then in November of 2022, you were at this crossroads, returning to an in-house corporate role or continuing on the entrepreneurial path.
Yeah.
What made that moment such a turning point for you?
That was a crazy time because prior to that, I had a startup and we raised private equity, and was really excited about this opportunity, and launched it with one of my really close buddies, and we were having a lot of success. And I think the trajectory looked really bright, and the market is extremely cruel at times, and a lot of the execution takes capital, and I think we were figuring out how to execute with a lack of capital, a lack of resources, and things just compound from there. So I invested so much after business school into this type of company, and was pretty just bummed about like it not going the right way. And I was interviewing for a couple of kind of in-house corporate roles, and I just, I didn't feel right, Michelle. Like, I just didn't feel one, that they appreciate the experience that I had. I think sometimes corporate America will look at their environment as this omnipotent type of offering. And, I've been exposed to both corporate and entrepreneurial. There has never been an entrepreneur that I've seen that has provided a least amount of skills than a corporate America professional. And I don't say that like to be disrespectful to people in corporate America. I think it's just a different type of kind of tenacity that is required. And, I felt in that moment, I'm like, well, I have so much to offer. You know, if I go back into this environment, one, I'm starting, at some entry level, I have tons of experience. Two, you know, am I going to actually enjoy being in this environment again? Right. Like, I think at that point, I had optimized what God wanted me to learn from those environments. And typically, when I'm in a scenario, Michelle, where I'm just a little bit unsure, right, and I need some clarity, I typically walk around and walk near water. It's more like a spiritual cleansing for me. So during this time when I was thinking about like what my next steps, was going to be, I was walking near some water and just praying. And, in that moment of just unsure, kind of futuristic elements, um, I just felt like a spirit over me, and like a voice, a calming voice that said like you have it all, like I've given it to you all. I've given you the corporate experience. You've excelled there. I've given you the entrepreneurial experience. You've excelled there. You went to the #1 business program for entrepreneurship, right, at Babson. You excelled there, right? You have the ability to navigate all these different environments. You're intelligent. You have charisma, right? Like, you have confidence. You have all these different things. And in that moment, the calmness was you have all the ingredients, right? You have the house to cook the food in, you have the utensils, you have the groceries, you have it all. At this point, Chad, it's on you to figure out your recipe. And for me, the voice was calming but very loud simultaneously. And I always get chills when I tell this story because it's so real. It was so real that at that moment I knew the direction that I needed to take. And at that moment, Michele, I also realized that the recipe that I was going to create will be a commodity, right? With like autonomous fungibility. And I knew that that was going to be my competitive advantage, that anytime I went into these rooms, I was able to leverage what I had to go and cultivate and what I had to figure out on my own and navigate through something that was just really confusing and unsure. That was going to be, my superpower to, achieve my gift and my vision that, I had ever since I was, a 10-year-old kid. So yeah, that's a story that I love telling because it was real and it set me on the path and trajectory that where I am today.
It's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that. How did that moment reshape how you wanted to show up as a leader?
I think, yeah, I mean that's a deep question, right? That I can respond in so many different ways. I feel, Michele, that that moment really helped me understand how someone who has so much at their disposal could still be confused and unsure. And for me, it gave me ability to say, okay, I now know how to resonate. And not now because I've been through a lot of moments, but on the entrepreneurial side, right? Like I know what that feeling feels like. And when you have a family and you have responsibilities, like I understand what that weight feels like. And having the ability to now empathize with other folks who obviously have been through that scenario and had that weight and burden on them. I think for me, it gave me a sense of understanding and how to engage with other folks that are entrepreneurs and going through this journey. So I think for me, it just shaped or more strengthened my emotional intelligence and being able to empathize with, my fellow entrepreneurs and founders and being able to say, hey, look, I've been there. I've walked blindly. I've ran blindly and not know what's in front of me. I know what that is, but I also know, what that would essentially feel like if I kept doing, something that just wasn't ordained for me to do, right? And i.e., going back to corporate America. And, I felt like going through the experience and the maturation of that crossroad, I think for me just helped have a better understanding of how to support other entrepreneurs, authentically.
Let's take another short break. And when we return, we'll explore how Chad's leadership style has evolved and the mistakes that shaped the leader he is today. Leadership isn't just about strategy, it's about people. The Forward Project helps organizations cultivate strong, adaptable leaders who create thriving workplace cultures. If you're ready to invest in your leadership team, visit www.theforwardproject.co to learn how. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, here with Chad Patterson, whose work focuses on helping people recognize their value and build systems that support long-term impact. Chad, looking back, what's a mistake that you made as a leader that fundamentally changed how you lead today?
Do we have more time? There's so many mistakes that I've made. But I think always, if it's a lesson from it, it's a blessing from it, right? But I would say to your question, I think one mistake that I made that I really had to rewrite and restructure is like not asking enough questions, and meaning in particular, you know, listening to respond rather than listening to learn. And oftentimes, I would listen to see, okay, where's my point to respond to them, right? Versus, all right, let me listen to them to learn their perspective or learn what they're trying to communicate. And I think for me, asking more questions allowed me to have a deeper understanding of their philosophy and a deeper understanding of like their world and their lens and what they're trying to achieve. And for me, one of my gifts, Michele, is I'm very intuitive. So, information feeds my gift and allows me to then leverage my ability to think intuitively and to make the right decisions based on feelings and data. And I think having to learn to ask more questions and dig a little bit deeper into people's decision making and logic, and then doing it in a manner that I you know intrinsically wanted to learn, what that is versus just, hey, I just want to hear what you're saying so I can give you a response. I think for me, that, fundamentally changed how I lead in engaging from a communicative standpoint with folks that, I am collaborating with.
Now, you've said earlier in your career journey that you led more as a director,
Yeah.
talking first and setting direction.
Yeah.
What helped you to make the shift toward inviting others' perspectives?
I think what I challenged, what I struggled with at first, Michele, was I felt that like if I controlled more, then I had more clarity on like the outcome. And I think that comes from just, being in disadvantaged environments, right? Like if you can control more, okay, like this is what my body can handle and what, what my body can manage. So I think that was like the core, right? So first understanding like how you can do something different is you first have to understand like what's driving that like decision making and approach. And I think, I learned like, being a director kind of at times really compromises innovation, compromises creativity and it really compromises a thriving culture. There's a saying that Steve Jobs says that that said that I really taken this like you hire smart people for them to tell you what to do, not for you to tell them what to do. And I think that philosophy is something that I really was able to acquire, and then really trying to seek out like information, which I think is really important, and that really allowing the person to feel empowered, right? They feel like they have autonomy as well. And then also like that makes a very collaborative like culture. And for me, I had to learn that. And I think today, you would say people that come across me and work with me, I think they would say, he's a very collaborative type of person. He wants to hear your perspective. He values your insight. If your decision or your suggestion is better and like it didn't come from him, like he'll go with it, right? And he's going to try to make sure it actually is a success. There's sometimes when people would, be spiteful and say like, I'll go with your decision, although it wasn't mine. And then they don't add any value to it, right? Like they almost don't want it to succeed because it wasn't their thought, right? Or their suggestion. I'm not that type of person. I want it to win. I want us to win. So if you make a suggestion and it didn't come from my brain, great. It doesn't matter. I can add some sort of value to it to make sure it's brought to fruition. And, I think, shifting from more of a director to more of a collaborator is like something that really helped me develop my leadership capabilities and sharpen my acumen a lot better.
And when you appreciate people's contributions and empower them, that's when they show up at their best and bring their full potential to bear.
Yeah,
That is what generates higher productivity and commitment and innovation.
absolutely. I mean, we all have a gift, Michele. So, if you're doing all the directing, I mean, how is people able to deploy that gift? And I think that is really important is empowering people to have a voice and have a say. And I think it, as you alluded to, it just brings out so many different valuable results, both short term and long term.
And everyone also has different working styles. They operate differently, as you've noted.
Yeah.
So, how do you optimize for that while still setting clear expectations and also stretching people toward growth?
Yeah, I think for me, finding what people tick, like what makes people tick is really important. Everyone has something that like really drives them and motivates them, their why. So I think it goes back to learning about the folks in your group or who you're partnering with and understanding kind of what areas that, really motivate them or really drive them. I think in terms of, still having clear expectations, I think a way for that has worked for me is establishing clear and expected outcomes and timelines, right? I think that typically gives people a goal in mind. Like I'm a sports guy, so everything I've always thought about is like, what's the goal in mind? So if you tell me the goal is here, great, I'm working towards that goal. I think ambiguity is when people start to, lose productivity. So I think, establishing those clear expected outcomes, and then when you expect those outcomes to be delivered is really important for you as a leader in the organization. And I think just encouraging folks to lean into their superpower, right? Everyone has some sort of superpower that they naturally do well in their sleep. It doesn't really require a lot of effort. For me, speaking with people, right? I'm pretty agnostic. I can speak to someone, who is a lawyer, right, in-house counsel at a Fortune 100 company. I can speak to someone who did 15 to 20 years in jail, right? And I have the ability to engage with those type of, different people. So that's natural for me, right? So communication is like a superpower for me. So I think just finding out people's superpower and then putting them in those right roles to thrive because their superpower, you know, affects that particular responsibility and role. I think that part is really important and very intentional and is required to make sure, that it optimizes people's different approach to life and approach to the professional world.
We're going to take a brief pause, and when we return, we'll talk about vision, alignment, and the systems Chad is building to scale globally. Don't go anywhere. By partnering with Expressions of Leadership, you'll reach an audience of professionals passionate about leadership and growth. For sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com. You're listening to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and my guest today is Chad Patterson, entrepreneur, technologist, and builder of systems designed to expand access and opportunity. Chad, I'd like to circle back to a concept that we talked about earlier that plays a central role in your leadership, and that is vision. How do you define vision, and what does shared alignment look like when it's truly working?
Yeah, Michelle. So I would define vision as really like seeing a new world before it's actualized, right? Like that is what vision is to me. Something that is just it is not here yet, but you see it, you feel it, right? You can taste it. I think in terms of shared alignment and what it looks like when it's truly working, I think a few words come to mind. It's collaborative, right? It's communicative, it's accountable, it's motivating, it's refreshing, right? Like that is the result of that type of synergy from being aligned with a variety of different elements.
Now, part of your personal vision has come to life through a platform that you built called Circle Bonds, which is designed to help people both take ownership of their own lives and also their financial futures. What gap did you see that led to create Circle Bonds, and how does it reflect your leadership philosophy?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just working with so many different small businesses, and seeing like the constant plight that they all faced. And when you look at Circle, it's a online investment platform. that helps small and medium-sized businesses get access to capital that they need to execute on market opportunities, right? And I think historically founders are like forced to take on all the downside risks when building a company. And at Crcle, we believe that the philosophy that that founders should take on all that financial responsibility is opaque, and I think fundamentally irresponsible. I think the numbers substantiate that, right? Over 82% of founders fail due to cash flow issues, right? So the financial system is not built to fund small businesses at scale, and founders are creators, Michele, right? Like we're very creative beings. And you want founders to focus on creating, right? That next iteration of the world we live in or the world we operate in. And having them to force them to use their personal funds and blend that with business funds and stuff, it just creates a very friction-oriented environment, and the founder's not able to execute in a flow and rhythm, because they're worried about, hey, my house is mortgaged or my house is collateralized for this loan, or my credit card debt is like ballooning. And that's really what Crcle is designed to support, those type of founders who have clarity and are looking to capitalize off of market opportunities. And then the other part, when you look at investing, Michele, trillions of dollars lay dormant in American citizen savings account, earning less than 1%, right? Interest. And, for you look at any way of building wealth, investment has been probably the centralized driver to folks accumulating some sort of wealth. And, investing is really that bridge, right? So, 70% of US's GDP, right, is consumer spending. So it makes sense why the system is designed that way, to not encourage investing, to encourage spending. And again, at Crcle, we don't agree with that philosophy. We're democratizing access to capital and investments for those who are looking for a different future. And that was the biggest element that we saw in building this company is, the folks who have the ability to execute and have the creativity, let's get them the capital they need to do so. And then the folks who are looking for a brighter future and looking to accumulate, wealth and understand how investing can drive that, let's pair them with those type of folks. So, there's a shared, dovetail value. And that's what we're, really excited about bringing to the marketplace.
And you've described yourself as a researcher and a sponge, learning from all these different environments and cultures and businesses. How has that curiosity helped you to expand your work globally?
So I think I'm naturally a curious person. So I think that part is is important. I think my family will always say like Chad is someone who's never shying away from something that is unfamiliar. I lived in 5 different states. So I went to 3 different high schools in 4 years, not because like I was in trouble or anything, but my family moved. So I think, just being curious is something that naturally comes to me. So I would say, because of that, I always tend to seek out like new approaches, new technology, unconventional strategies, and how people in other environments or other global landscapes approach things. So I think for me, it's just having that curiosity and wanting to understand how things are done differently and why they're done differently is really important. And I think from there, it gives you the ability to understand, one, how you could be effective in those environments, but two, like what are the latest trends, like where you kind of index against other folks, right? In terms of like a skills gap and things of that sort. So I think just being curious is really important as a leader, because there's always new things that are coming in the market. There's always new approaches that people are leveraging and having success with. And I think, in order to be an innovative leader, you have to be on the forefront and of that cutting edge opportunities. And I think that starts with being curious.
And through these systems you've created and the platforms that you've built, you've supported more than 1,400 small businesses globally. From all of these businesses, what has surprised you the most about the people you serve?
Yeah, I think what surprised me probably the most, honestly, Michelle, is that, founders are subject matter experts, right? It's like we really understand our subject that we're navigating in. However, over 90%, really have an anemic financial acumen, meaning like there's just not a deep understanding of like the unit economics, right? Or economies of scale. And I mean, a lot of times because of that, founders typically choose like wrong types of funding or, you know, wrong types of um, bringing on, different human resources and things of that sort. And I think that was the aha moment, Michelle, with Crcle was, okay, well, if these founders, don't have a great understanding on the financial side, like, let's give them the resources to understand that part. And then let's work with the ones who intrinsically understand how to multiply capital into generating something that's going to be appreciated, right? Whether that's revenue, whether that's more customers, more product, right? Inventory. So I think that was really the part that helped birth Crcle was, okay, I've dealt with small businesses in London. I've dealt with small businesses in Nigeria. I dealt with small businesses in New York. I dealt with small businesses in Louisiana. And like unilaterally, they all had the same kind of challenges, not having access to capital, and then also not necessarily focusing on the unit economics of how to multiply the capital when you do get it. So, debt becomes good debt, not bad debt, right? So I would say that's probably like the part that I was surprised that, okay, this is an issue across the board for, all, a majority of the founders that were having some exposure to.
Well, let's take our final break. And when we come back, we'll look ahead to the future, the legacy that Chad wants to leave, and wrap up with some wisdom and whimsy. We'd love for you to be a part of the Expressions of Leadership community. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, here with Chad Patterson, whose leadership journey centers dignity, access, and building systems that help people take ownership of their own lives. Chad, when you look ahead, what's your vision for the future, both for your work and for the communities that you serve?
For me, we serve entrepreneurs, right? In both my business ventures. And I would say the future, and from my lens of entrepreneurship is just that space growing rapidly. And I think, it's it growing through community, right? And I think that is a part, Michelle, that you'll find the next iteration of founders and entrepreneurs thriving because they've built a community around them, right? Where they can lean into when they're building something, lean into when they need some more support, or they just need a following that believes into what they're building. I think that's typically what like a VC infrastructure would bring, right? Is like they bring that type of infrastructure. I think the folks that are able to develop a community, that's going to be the future of entrepreneurship because then they're going to have the authentic infrastructure in order for them to be a sustainable company. And then I also believe that strategic partnerships, will be the linchpin to valuation appreciation, meaning, collaborating with different groups and who serve the same customer as you, right? But may serve them in a different experience. I think collaborations is going to be the future in strategic partnerships where folks are looking to partner up together to offer a customer, a variety of value, right? And I think that is going to make the customer experience a lot better. So I would say those two things is, driving entrepreneurship through community and then growing that, community and growing that company through strategic partnerships.
And what legacy do you hope to leave as a leader?
Yeah, I always desire to be known as a leader who brought the best out of those who I was around, and I helped them optimize their gift. And I think for me, that is something that I reverence because, again, I think everyone has a gift. And I think the world is better when you are deploying your gift often and always. And as a leader, if I can be alongside you and ensure that first we understand your gift and we identified it, and we're ensuring that it's being utilized and frequently optimized, I think that is just making the world a better place. And I think everybody has the ability to make the world better and bigger. And, for me, that's the legacy that, I believe I am shaping up in leading, and will, leave when I'm long gone.
Well, before we move into our final segment of the show, how can the audience learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn, Chad Patterson. I'm on Instagram. My handle is at Chad Swade, so SWADE. Same thing on TikTok. So yeah, and you can always reach out on one of those mediums and I'll say hello, or if you have any questions, if I have an answer or whatnot, I'll try to provide that. Or if I have someone who does have the answer, then I will be sure to connect you as well.
And how can people learn more about Circle Bonds?
Yeah, so you can visit circlebonds.com. There's no I in circle, right? So I'm all about a team effort. So it's CRCLEBONDS.com. And yeah, we are looking to set a really new pathway for entrepreneurship and investing. And we're excited. So, if you want to join the community and join what we're building, we would love to have you.
And now it's time for our wisdom and whimsy segment of the show, where I get to ask the guest one advice question and one fun question. Let's begin with the advice question. If you could redefine success for leaders today, how would you do so?
Yeah, I think, Michelle, that's a good question. From my lens, I would say, understanding that leadership is a service, right? It's not about you, it's about the group and about what the group can get from your leadership abilities. I think I've been across a lot of leaders who were very selfish and self-absorbed, right? And it was about them and, how their legacy is going to be, defined. And I think for me, that always just really gave me a visceral feeling because I just think that is the opposite of what a leader is, right? And a leader is, how do you make people better? How do you make people feel better about themselves? And how do you equip people with the right skills and the right tools and the right environments to succeed? And, when you leave that room, how do people speak about you and who you are as a person and your morals and your character, not, what you have done for a company or, what you have actually achieved that, is attached to who you are or your professional identity. And, so I think for me, it's, leaders understanding that it's not about you. It is about the people that you collaborate with and you lead, and then are you putting them in the right positions to win? And I think that to me is what defines leaders, is not individualized success. It's a group success, and then people are in better positions financially, emotionally, spiritually, physically, from you being in their presence and demonstrating leadership in an authentic way.
And now it's time for the fun question. What's something that you loved as a kid and still enjoy now?
All right. So every year during Christmas, religiously, I watch Home Alone. Home Alone 1, Home Alone 2. It's probably my favorite. And it's like nostalgic for me because I remember growing up, during the holidays, that's something like my sister and I would watch, and I would, watch it all the time, and loved Macaulay Culkin and his rambunctious behavior, and out witting all these different people. I always thought that was cool. So even to this day, I'm 39. I was watching it last month. And my wife was like, "You're watching this again?" And yeah, it is such a good feel good story. It brings back great memories for the holidays for me and growing up. And I remember a lot of the sayings and whatnot. And sometimes I'm probably mouthing it off while I'm watching, and my wife is looking at me crazy. But yeah, that's something that I still do. I have a daughter, so I wonder if that's something that she will like at some point. I mean, she's only almost 2 months, so it's probably too early for Home Alone. But maybe that's something that her and I will enjoy when she's able to watch TV. There's no screens right now. Mom is very strict about that. So, when she gets older, maybe that's something that, she can join in on, that nostalgic feeling in our family kind of tradition.
Well, Chad, thank you so much for your honesty, for your authenticity. I really appreciate how you're redefining leadership as service and alignment and really belief in people. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And to our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and subscribe to Expressions of Leadership wherever you listen to podcasts, and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also join us every Saturday and Sunday at noon on Radio Evolve Santa Barbara at radioevolve.rocks. This has been Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, inviting you to consider who around you has untapped potential, and what would it look like to help create space for it? See you next time. If you haven't done so already, make sure to click on that follow button so you don't miss out on future episodes. Have a guest you'd like us to interview? Questions, ideas, or just want to say hello? You can reach us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com or connect with us on Instagram or YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, thanks to our amazing team behind the scenes for making this podcast possible, including our sound engineer, Graham Palmer, and my chief encourager and advisor, Jeremiah Higgins.